Now, word spotting, if you're going to use that for security purposes, you're likely going to have to establish baseline or threshold to prevent false alarms. Because let's face it, large organizations, again, somebody's going to forget their login, they're going to forget their password. If you've built up a more sophisticated vocabulary, depending upon how paranoid you are, if somebody calls in asking about your routers, is that a hacker or is it a sales guy? Well, if it's a sales guy, if it's a sales guy from Juniper and he wants to sell you upgrades to your, he wants to sell you upgrades on your gear, well, then that doesn't have to sound an alarm. But if somebody's calling in asking about your router gear and you don't know them from Adam, then that's an area of concern as well. Probably, unfortunately, I suspect that initially voice analytics is going to get used a lot for post-attack reconstruction. A company's going to get hit. They're going to realize that they've been compromised, and through some means they've realized to identify a bad actor through their voice print and word spotting. Once they've identified a single phone call where an attacker has called in, they can go ahead and use that information and figure out, okay, how many phone calls did this guy make? What information did he ask for? So they can go back through a log of calls and they can trace back who was called, identify the methods that this guy used in order to get the information, and identify what information was used to compromise the company. And once you've got that information, of course, you can generate a full time-stamped audit trail as to who called, when they called, and again, where they called if the caller ID wasn't compromised. On the other hand, hackers aren't stupid. Anybody trying to compromise your system may be aware that you may use voice analytics against you. So they may have tactics to get around a high-tech electronic filtering system. And on the other side of the coin, you'll be able to take countermeasures in order to prevent these methods from being compromised. Whitelist. Again, if you look at sneakers, my voice is my passport, and then you had somebody using a tape recorder, and then you had this whole elaborate scene where this woman was trying to get this geek to say passport. These days, you don't need a tape recorder. You can just use anything like, an iPod to record, or an MP3 player to record somebody's voice print, and then use a laptop to polish up the product. You can play it on an iPod, you can play it on an MP3 player in order to simulate a voice print. Now, the countermeasure for that is if somebody's trying to beat voice print with a CAN thing, you can use emotion detection. Because if somebody's playing you a canned response, they're not going to be able to spike, make things happy, make things sad, but the underlying software analyzing the call can detect that. Another countermeasure that people are going to use is what I call the phrase that pays. When you go into HR to get your voice print logged in the future, they're going to give you a list of 25 random words to repeat. They can get a voice print and a vocabulary that they can recognize you by. Now, what's going to happen is if you need to be authenticated in an automated fashion, you'll have some sort of daily random generated phrase that you'll have to repeat on the fly, and then you'll have a certain amount of time in order to repeat that phrase in order to be authenticated. That's going to be much harder to spoof rather than a single sentence CAM phrase. Especially if you're trying to, you're not going to be able to cut and paste words that fast. Word spotting. It's a little bit harder to beat, but people are going to be creative about it. I mean, if an attacker knows that you have certain hot words that you look for, like password, like user ID, they'll probably try to use some sort of substituted phrases. But that could also be very awkward. If you're going to ask somebody for their user ID and password, what's a synonym for user ID? your login. Okay, well, we'll put that in the vocabulary we'll analyze, and so forth. Alternatively, if somebody's running an attack and they realize that you're looking for words, people are going to be running a slow attack to avoid that baseline or threshold of things. Because again, you're going to have a certain amount of phone calls during the course of the day where people are talking about passwords, either getting a new password set up, or again, if you're looking for routers as your hot word, your Juniper rep's going to call in to try to sell you XYZ, and he's going to talk about routers. The canny attacker is probably going to do something where he makes a call a day or a call per week, something that doesn't set off alarms, but something that he can gather the information he needs and build his mosaic. It's going to take him longer, but he'll still do it. Alternatively, the attacker can try to get as much needed information, all the needed information he needs as fast as possible to set up an attack, gather it, build his picture, go in, break the system, and get out, all before security has a chance to react. But that's it's going to be a lot trickier if there's a lot of key pieces of information he or she needs. And again, countermeasures for word spotting. You can build rule sets, if, then, else's, ands, to match keywords to your heart's content. It'll increase your rate of false positives or alarms, but some people are going to live that. And again, you can also mix keyword monitoring with unique voice print. So how do you beat the blacklist? Let's say, for instance, I have Kevin Mitnick's voice print on file. Well, all Kevin has to do is get a friend or a circle of friends to go and ask a question at a time for a social engineering attack and gather the information that way. You don't have to be the sole actor involved to gather information in order to beat a blacklist. On the other hand, it requires multiple people to be involved. Well, how many people can you have involved? And I saw this in Benjamin Franklin. How many saw that and thought of Karl Rove or Dick Cheney? 3 can keep a secret if 2 are dead. Okay, the more people you have involved in terms of an attack, the larger the potential for leaks, the larger for potential of just having to deal with psychodrama. I mean, things get more complicated. Another countermeasure again is the shared blacklist. Companies are going to share blacklists of voice prints. If they share them around in real time, social engineering attacks are going to get detected faster. Tactics, I love this one. Hack the analytics box. Voice analytics systems, most of them are Windows-based. Your best case is that if you have an analytics box running and it goes through some sort of denial of service, or the server crashes for some unknown reason, well, hey, guess what? That gives you an indication you're being attacked. Now, the attack crash is going to give you a date or time for when you might have been penetrated. Worst case is if somebody owns the box and understands the software, everything on the box is fair game, and they're going to be able to edit whitelist, blacklist, vocabulary, monitor phrases. So the countermeasure to that is secure an analytics box, that's going to process voice just like you would anything else. You got to secure it physically, you got to secure the network. And then the one thing I think that goes without saying is that whoever operates this box has to be a trusted character, because if he's an inside guy, then this layer of security is blown if he's the guy that's crashing your network. Summary. Okay. Again, voice analytics is being used today in call centers, in the Fortune 500 and government applications to spot fraud, to identify people. Again, the insurance companies are the big ones. They want to save money. They want to catch people trying to rip them off. The software technology is not cheap, but prices are likely to decline. Again, the most expensive piece of technology in building a voice analytics system is basically the speech-to-text engine, because disks are cheap, drives are cheap, servers are cheap. And then your first implementations of people who are implementing this technology are high security, high risk organizations. Again, Who's going to do identity theft? That sort of thing. Food for thought. Again, this technology is so cheap anybody can do it, so you don't have to worry, people shouldn't worry about Echelon USA, people should worry about Echelon Sweden, or Echelon China, or Echelon Russia. The gear is cheap, the software is off the shelf. I mean, these systems is based in Israel. It's not too much of a stretch to think that Israel may have the capability for their own little voice analytics thing. All they need to do is be able to get access to a telephone call flow in countries they may be interested in, like, I don't know, Lebanon, and sort through that stuff and ID and fill out a voice print ID so they can go find people. And again, it's not only nation states that have this capability. New York City could pay for a capability like this. New York City has, thousands of cops, and I don't know how much their budget is, but they've got a multi-billion dollar police budget. I don't know. But anyways, for somebody like New York City to build their own system to process through phone calls and find people by voice print ID is not a big stretch of the imagination. It's not just for Big Brother anymore. In terms of the U.S. government, it's any government that can go buy the software. Corporate government, true. Well, you've got no privacy. Again, the trend is if you've got an IP-PBX, the next step is, well, we want to record all phone calls in and out because we want to analyze the data or we want to protect ourselves. The downside of this is if you work for an exceptionally paranoid private employer, you can monitor phone calls for things like if you're looking for a new job, you call your boss a fuckhead once too often. I mean, it's easy enough to do. And then finally, if you thought that DNA was bad, that is, if you leave your DNA everywhere, well, your voice print, you can pull that off of speeches, pull that off of public conversation, phone calls, podcasting. Your voice can be found everywhere. BBN actually has a service where they're taking podcasts, they're doing speech to text, and then they're indexing podcasts based upon the words in podcasts on the internet. One step beyond that is you can use, build your own database or index of voice print IDs to identify people, which brings us to Google Voice. One day, somebody like Google or somebody else may actually have a database of verified voice print that people can access to make sure that if you're calling, if somebody calls you and their caller ID says X, you may be able to punch a button and feed their voice print over to Google, and Google may be able to go, user verified, and then you can go talk to them. So, my email address again on the notes. Any questions, comments? Yes, sir. Well, I think that they're kind of focused on, they're more focused on the U.S. government. They're less focused on big business because, frankly, your privacy, quote unquote, in the workplace is practically nil because your employees